Most Americans proudly called themselves English subjects even into the 1750s. By 1773, however, administrative changes in the enforcement of colonial policies brought differences between the English colonies and the English homeland to a head. English ties to the colonies remained loose, decentralized, and inefficient under Kings George I and II. As a result, colonial assemblies took up the business of limited self-government in the absence of the English Parliament, without a peep of English protest for the first 100 years of colonial existence. The French and Indian War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War in Europe, upset the careful balance struck between the growing British Empire and English colonists. By 1700, the French controlled much of the interior of the American continent, including the Mississippi River and adjoining trade routes. The French and English powers coexisted on the continent until conflicts on the European continent, i.e. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, sent colonial politics into a tailspin. Both sides, the French and the British, worked continuously to ally themselves with American natives, knowing that conflict for the continent would be inevitable. The Iroquois Confederacy of 5 Indian nations remained the continental power both sides desperately needed to capture the continent. In 1754, border tensions between the French and English eventually set off a 9-year French and Indian War for control of the American continent. The war can be broken into 3 distinct phases. In the first phase, French and Indian tribes and their allies launched assaults on Western English outposts where colonists fought back without any help from England. Second, fighting stretched into the West Indies, into Europe, and into the colonies proper, led by William Pitt, the British Secretary of State, so the British finally get involved. The British forced colonists into service to create armies. The British seized colonial food and weapons, and the British quartered troops in colonial homes with no promise of reimbursement for any of it. This created domestic friction that almost brought the English war effort to a halt. In the third phase, William Pitt reversed his most obnoxious policies, and the French and Indians were unable to sustain their progress with the English military and the colonies firmly against them. At the Peace of Paris in 1763, the French ceded their continental claims to America. The victorious British, deeply in debt and unhappy with the colonial effort during the war, decided to take a larger role in organizing and controlling their colonies. Colonists who had, for the first time, acted in concert as united colonies during the conflict retained deep concern over British authority taken during the war and moved for the first time to separate themselves from Europe and to a greater degree England. The French and Indian War was a disaster for American natives, even those who had aligned themselves with the British who won. The English regarded their native allies as too passive during the war, and whatever relationship they had was shattered by later fighting over the Ohio Valley. The English Empire of Great Britain, at peace for the first time in 50 years, turned its focus in 1763 toward growing a worldwide empire. To pay off its debts, England turned to its colonies to foot the bill. King George III ascended to the royal throne at an unfortunate moment. He was determined to reassert the power of the monarchy, and he was legitimately mentally unstable. You can see it in the film The Madness of King George from 1984. That's a good movie. His prime minister, too, was a hardliner that wanted to place the colonies fully under English control. The king, the prime minister, and the government or parliament of England proceeded to issue a series of proclamations and laws designed to bring the colonies under control and to essentially punish the colonies for needing their help during the war. The Proclamation of 1763 was an effort to forbid the Western movement of free whites in the colonies. That movement, those sorts of movements, tended to incite conflicts with the natives, naturally. It makes sense. The law failed when the English failed to actually enforce the policy, despite fears such movements might restart a continental conflict with native peoples. The Mutiny Act of 1765 cemented a permanent British troop presence in the colonies and forced the colonists to foot the bill. The Sugar Act and Currency Acts of 1764 increased sugar taxes and made it illegal to issue currency in the colonies. At first, these policies were difficult for colonists to protest. Soon, though, colonists began to rally around their distrust of England, their homeland. Merchants suffered from the increases in taxation. Trappers were hemmed in by restrictive movements. And with the institution of a permanent troop presence, ordinary colonists came face to face with British power personified. Accustomed to a wide latitude when it came to colonial policies, especially in regards to taxes, the British challenged the foundation of colonial political power after the French and Indian War. By 1765, the hardening of British policies and colonial resistance brought on a series of events that would unravel the British Empire. The incredible Stamp Act of 1765 placed an unprecedented tax on every piece of paper, whether it be a book, a newspaper, a map, or a legal document, printed and sold in the colonies, which multiplied the colonial tax burden tenfold. Where earlier taxes had only touched imports and exports, the Stamp Act was levied directly on commerce and business contained exclusively in the colonies, business that had nothing to do with England proper. Colonial assemblies, which had not been consulted before the law was put into effect, immediately balked at the concept of no taxation without representation in the English Parliament. So they're being taxed, but they have no one to speak for them in the English Parliament. They're not being treated like English citizens. Patrick Henry protested the tax, and ordinary Americans boycotted British goods until the law was overturned in 1766. The conflict playing out in England and her colonies was not only a war of words. Fighting between British troops on the docks of Boston and American dock workers was frequent. On March 5th, 1770, troops at the Boston Customs House, under a hail of snowballs and rocks from angry Bostonians, fired on and killed 5 civilians. An accident. The event was to become the Boston Massacre. It played into the hands of those colonists hostile to British imperialism. Finally, they had a smoking gun. They had evidence that British troops were a burden on the American colonies. Paul Revere and Sam Adams emerged as early leaders of the separatist movement in the colonies. Both men worked hard to keep the anti-tax protest alive, and a spirit of dissent spread across the colonies due to the deliberate actions of a loose confederacy of like-minded Americans. The philosophy of colonial revolt was a product of the times, made possible only by repeated abuses of power by the British. The people of the colonies had carved a civilization from the wilderness and expected their government to be responsive to its people. The English Constitution, meanwhile, was and is totally unwritten and rooted in precedent and established in an older era of kings. As King George III became more hostile to the colonies, colonists understood they were being treated differently than other English subjects, and they demanded political representation. This is an idea foreign to the English, who enjoyed only virtual representation. The taverns or bars of the colonies became places where colonists could voice dissent, and pamphlets were written, published, and distributed all over the emerging nation. Despite all this brewing discontent, the English passed the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the East India Company permission to sell its tea tax-free in the colonies, undercutting existing American tea merchants who still had to pay the tax. Boycotts of tea, led by the revolutionary group, the Daughters of Liberty, sprung up all across the colonial seaboard and stood as the first real, unified political act of the colonies. As East India Company tea shipments landed in Boston in late 1773, 150 men dressed as Mohawk Indians broke onto the ships and dumped the tea into the Boston harbor at the Boston Tea Party, as it became known. After the shock of the Boston Tea Party, a vindictive English Parliament passed a series of coercive acts designed to punish the colonies and neuter the government of Massachusetts, which backfired badly. The other colonies rallied around Massachusetts and began a widespread boycott of British goods that further unified these disparate colonies. Remember, these colonies came to exist. There were different groups of people that came for different reasons, but they all began to unify against England. Disgruntled representatives of the individual colonies met at the First Colonial Congress in September of 1774, and they made 5 important decisions. They agreed that they rejected a weak form of colonial union under British rule. They passed a moderate statement of grievances against English aggressions. They backed defensive military preparations in Massachusetts, where the British and the colonists were mostly fighting. They instituted a formal boycott of British goods and established a Continental Association to see their decrees made public and acted upon. Number 5, they agreed to meet as the Second Colonial Congress again that following spring. Aware that colonial animosity was strengthening, the English Parliament, for their part, considered and passed a series of conciliatory propositions in early 1775. But news of these English concessions would not arrive in the colonies until the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired. After that First Continental Congress had concluded, the Minutemen of Massachusetts prepared for a defensive war at the conflict's flashpoint in and around Boston. When the British sought the arrest of revolutionary agitators Sam Adams and John Hancock outside of Boston, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out to warn colonists ahead of the British march to Lexington and Concord, and the British and colonists traded fire all along the road. Only a handful of people died on each side, but the bloody incident was added to the narrative of British atrocities begun at the Boston Massacre, attracting thousands more to the cause of the American rebels. The second episode of bloodshed in Massachusetts drove both the king and the most strident of colonial rebels into formal, intractable conflict. The war between the colonies and the English homeland had begun.